The desert had a way of swallowing secrets. Under the wide Apache skies, where the wind carried whispers of old legends, a young woman walked with quiet strength. She had been born different, her body carrying a disability that set her apart from the rest of her people. In a world where survival depended on speed, endurance, and the ability to fight, she was often overlooked, cast into the shadows of silence. Her heart, however, was as fierce as the eagle that circled above the cliffs. And though no one wanted to stand by her side, she dreamed of a love that would see her not as broken, but as whole. Her people respected her lineage. Yet when it came to choosing a mate, the young warriors turned away. They wanted women who could ride fast, carry water from the river with ease, and bear children without hardship. Though she carried a gentle spirit and wisdom beyond her years, the whispers followed her everywhere. She was the girl who would be left behind. Her mother would sometimes press her hand and remind her the Creator gives strength in many ways. You are not less, you are different. But in the long nights, when the fires burned low and the drums echoed into the mountains, the young woman's eyes filled with quiet tears. It was during these same nights that another figure rode along the edge of town. A sheriff, known for his silence more than his words, carried the weight of scars no one could see. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, his movements deliberate, his heart tethered to a past he rarely spoke of. He had come to the territory not seeking glory, but peace. Yet peace was never easy in a land where greed, lawlessness, and prejudice walked hand in hand. The sheriff had seen many faces outlaws, ranchers, miners, and wanderers, but something in the Apache village drew his attention. He rode there often, not always with a reason. Some said he admired the discipline of the people. Others thought he sought an alliance. But the truth was simpler. He felt the call of something unfinished. Something he did not yet understand. The girl first saw him one afternoon. While sitting near the stream that wound like silver through the valley, she noticed the way he dismounted his horse, slow, respectful, never in a rush. He carried himself as though he belonged nowhere and everywhere at the same time. To her, who had always been treated as fragile, his presence seemed steady, unshaken. For a moment, she wondered what it would be like if someone like him looked past her weakness and truly saw her. But such dreams were dangerous. In the village, her worth had already been weighed and found lacking. No suitor had come forward. Some spoke openly of her fate. She would live with her family, tend the fires, and watch as others built lives of their own. Love, companionship, children, all were things whispered about, never meant for her. The cruelest among the young men laughed that, even if she wished for a mate, none would claim her. She bore the sting of those words in silence, her only escape the solitude of the desert. Where the land itself seemed to understand her heart, the sheriff, too, carried silence like a shield. He rarely laughed, rarely spoke of his past, and yet his actions told a story. He treated people with fairness, even when others would not. He stood between violence and the innocent, even when it cost him friends. Still, he was a man outside the lines, neither fully trusted by the settlers nor fully welcomed by the Apache. To both sides, he was an enigma, a man who walked his own path. And yet, in a place where most men sought power, land, or gold, the sheriff seemed to search for something else. Perhaps it was redemption. Perhaps it was a reason to believe that kindness could still grow in soil hardened by hate. Whatever it was, it led him down trails where his silence spoke louder than words. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mesas and painted the sky in red fire, trouble found the valley. Riders came, men with greed in their eyes and little regard for life. The villagers braced themselves, for they knew the outsiders had little mercy for anyone who stood in their way. Among them, the girl stood close to her mother, her heart beating like a drum. She had no weapon, no strength to fight, yet she felt the sting of helplessness. The sheriff rode in at dusk, dust rising behind his horse. He saw the fear, heard the cries, and in that moment, his silence broke. With steady courage, he stepped forward, his hand resting near his holster, his voice low but clear. He was a man who did not need to shout to be heard. And though the riders outnumbered him, there was something in his stance that made even the boldest hesitate. The girl watched from the shadows. She did not know why, but her gaze locked on him as if her fate had been tied to his long before this night. Perhaps it was the way he carried his scars, unseen yet heavy, that reminded her of her own. Perhaps it was the way he stood alone yet unbroken. In him, she saw a reflection of her own soul. The riders sneered, threatening what they could not claim. The sheriff answered with calm defiance. What happened next would test the strength of both the villagers and the man who had wandered into their lives. And for the girl who had always been unwanted, this night would change the path of her story forever. Because sometimes it takes only one quiet man to hear the unspoken cries of someone forgotten. Sometimes destiny arrives not with thunder, but with the sound of hooves under a silent sky. And as the sheriff faced down danger with eyes steady and heart unshaken, the girl felt the first stirrings of hope that someone, at last, might see her not as weak, but as worthy. Yet the night was far from over. And the desert was not done testing hearts. The riders had not come for peace, and the sheriff could not fight their greed alone. What bound him to this girl and what fate awaited them both was only beginning to unfold. Would he survive what was to come? Would she finally step out of the shadows of rejection into a place where her spirit could be honored? The answers lay in the next turn of the story, as danger closed in and silence gave way to fire. The night carried a heavy silence after the riders halted, their horses restless beneath them. The sheriff's hand never wavered near his holster, though his calm eyes seemed to read every twitch of the intruder's movements. They were men used to taking what they wanted: land, cattle, and sometimes worse. Yet the way the sheriff stood before them unsettled them in a way they could not name. Behind him, the Apache villagers waited in tents, quiet, their torches flickering like small stars. The girl pressed closer to her mother, though her eyes remained fixed on the tall man who dared stand between their world and the approaching storm. But this was not the first time greed had reached their valley. For years, whispers of outsiders searching for silver and land had haunted the people. The territory was changing. The railroad was creeping closer, ranchers pushed their fences further, and treaties were written only to be broken. For a people who carried centuries of tradition, each new intrusion felt like a strike at their very survival. And now, the riders at the edge of the firelight looked as if they had come to test how far the Apache would bend before breaking. The girl had always lived in the shadows of her people's struggles. While others trained with the bow, rode long distances, and prepared for raids. She often stayed behind, her body unable to match their pace. But what she lacked in strength, she carried in quiet knowledge. She had learned to listen to the wind, to notice when the animals grew restless before danger, and to hear stories woven into silence. Her grandfather once told her, "The desert speaks to those who cannot run." Those words had become her comfort in times when loneliness cut deeper than any blade. Now, watching the sheriff stand against the riders, she wondered if he too had learned to hear silence as a kind of language. He did not shout. He did not boast. He simply stood there, as if the earth itself anchored him in place. She wondered what had shaped him, what old scars lay beneath his steady calm. The riders were not men to turn away easily. Their leader, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar across his cheek, leaned forward in his saddle. His voice was harsh, cutting through the night. He demanded what the villagers could not give: land, cattle, and obedience. When he threatened to return with more men, the sheriff's tone remained even. He spoke few words, but each landed like a stone. The riders laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that hid unease. After all, men like these thrived on fear, and here was a lawman who showed none. Still, they did not leave entirely. They circled slowly, their eyes watching every detail of the village. They wanted the people to know they were not safe. And with a final sneer, the leader promised they would return. Dust rose under their horses' hooves as they vanished into the darkness, leaving behind the weight of their words. The villagers released a collective breath, though relief did not settle. Everyone knew this was only a beginning. The threat had not passed, had only been delayed. Elders gathered to speak in low tones, Children were pulled back into homes, and women tended the fires as if light alone could keep danger away. The sheriff lingered at the edge of the circle, saying little, though his presence brought an odd steadiness. Some of the men approached him, questioning why he involved himself in matters that were not his own. Others thanked him quietly, for they knew his courage had kept blood from being spilled that night. Still, the tension between the sheriff and the Apache people was not so easily soothed. He was an outsider, and trust was not given quickly. The girl slipped away to the stream where she had first seen him. The water reflected the moonlight, soft and trembling, much like her own heart. She could not stop thinking of the way he stood, silent yet unmovable, against men who carried hatred in their eyes. For a moment, she wondered if destiny had sent him, or if it was foolishness to dream such things. After all, she had been taught not to hope for what could never be. The sheriff, alone by his horse, caught sight of her silhouette against the silver water. He said nothing, but something in her stillness drew him closer. They did not speak. They only shared a quiet glance, one that seemed to recognize something unspoken in the other. Then, just as quickly, he turned away, leaving her with a strange feeling she could not name in the days that followed. The rider's threat lingered like a storm cloud. Scouts reported seeing campfires on the ridges. Hunters found tracks where outsiders had no right to tread. The village prepared as best they could, though fear gnawed at even the bravest hearts. For the girl, life returned to its usual rhythm of being left behind. She carried water in small jars, tended fires, and listened to stories told by the elders. Yet everything felt changed. The memory of the sheriff's defiance kept returning, burning like a small flame inside her. She told herself it was nothing. He was a man with his own burdens, not someone who would look twice at her. And yet when she saw him ride through the valley again, her heart betrayed her with its quickening beat. The sheriff, too, found himself drawn back more often than he admitted. Perhaps it was duty. Perhaps it was something deeper. He spoke with the elders, offered advice on defense, and shared his knowledge of the riders who prowled the territory. He never spoke of his own past, though whispers followed him. Some said he had once lost his family to violence. Others claimed he had turned his back on lawmen who had forgotten what justice meant. Whatever the truth, he carried his silence like armor. But silence cannot hide everything. The girl began to notice small things, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching, how his eyes lingered on the horizon as if searching for ghosts. She wondered if pain recognized pain, if perhaps that was why her gaze kept being pulled back to him. The threat of the riders grew closer with each passing day. Their leader had not lied. He wanted what was not his, and he would not stop until he claimed it. The elders debated whether to fight or flee. Some argued they could not abandon their land, sacred to their ancestors. Others feared the blood that would be spilled. In the end, no clear decision was made. Fear has a way of dividing even the strongest. One evening, as the drums sounded across the valley, the sheriff rode into the heart of the village. His voice was calm, but his words cut deep. He warned that the riders would strike soon, and when they did, the people would need to choose unity over fear. Some welcomed his words. Others bristled at the idea of an outsider telling them what to do. Through it all, the girl listened quietly, her heart caught between two worlds. She was part of her people, yet she felt a connection to the sheriff that she could not explain. She knew he carried secrets, just as she carried her own wounds. And somehow, she sensed that their stories were bound together in ways neither yet understood. The desert wind rose that night, rattling the branches and carrying with it the scent of smoke from distant fires. It was a warning. The riders were closer than anyone wanted to believe. The girl lay awake, staring at the stars, wondering if tomorrow would bring peace or blood. She thought of the sheriff's eyes, steady even in the face of danger, and for the first time in her life, she felt that her fate might be tied not to rejection, but to something greater. But the riders were not the only danger lurking in the shadows. Secrets within the village, old grudges, and hidden betrayals would soon surface. And as the storm gathered strength, the girl and the sheriff would find themselves standing at the center of a battle not just for land, but for survival and, perhaps even for the chance at a love neither believed they deserved. The desert had tested many before them, and it was not done testing them now. The desert sky grew darker each evening, as if even the heavens sensed what was coming. The riders had not returned in full force yet, but their shadows were everywhere on the ridges, near the streams, and in the whispers of the people. Fear moved quietly among the villagers, creeping into their sleep, their meals, and their words. And though the sheriff warned them with calm certainty, trust was still a fragile thing. He was not one of them. He did not share their blood, their ancestors, or their ways. Yet strangely, carried himself as if their fight had become his own. The elders argued long into the night around the fire. Some believed the sheriff was a sign sent to help them, while others said no good could come from letting an outsider lead their defense. Old wounds lingered. Wounds from years of broken promises with men who wore badges or carried law on their lips, but none in their hearts. The sheriff sat apart from these arguments, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat, speaking only when asked. His silence made him difficult to read, but his steady presence unsettled both his enemies and his allies alike. The girl listened from the shadows, her place as always outside the circle of importance, yet she saw what others did not. She noticed the way the sheriff's eyes scanned the horizon even while others debated. She saw how his hand rested lightly on the butt of his revolver, ready for what might come. More than that, she felt the weight of his solitude, a burden she knew too well. It was not weakness, but a different kind of strength, one born from living with scars others could not see. But within the village, tensions began to grow in ways that had nothing to do with the riders. One young warrior, proud and hot-tempered, despised the sheriff's presence. He spoke boldly against him, saying it was an insult for their people to lean on a stranger when they had strong men of their own. His pride made him reckless, and though some admired his courage, others whispered that pride alone could not hold back the tide of violence that was coming. The girl knew his words carried danger, for division within was as deadly as enemies without. Meanwhile, the riders themselves were not idle. Their leader, the scarred man with the hard eyes, plotted with his followers. They wanted the land, not just for greed, but for control. The valley was rich with water, game, and hidden trails. Whoever claimed it could rule both settlers and natives alike. Yet he had not expected resistance from the sheriff, and that gnawed at him. And the sheriff's calm defiance was a challenge he could not ignore. As days passed, the villagers prepared quietly. Weapons were sharpened, traps laid, and scouts sent to watch the hills. The sheriff moved among them, not commanding, but guiding. He showed them how to defend choke points, how to hold their ground when outnumbered. Some followed his advice with gratitude. Others watched with suspicion, wondering what debt they would owe this man when all was over. But the girl noticed something no one else did, the way his voice softened when speaking to the children. The way his eyes grew heavy when the firelight flickered too long on his face. He carried ghosts, and she longed to know their names. Her own role remained small. She fetched water in small jars, gathered wood, and cared for the children when the mothers worked. Yet even in these quiet tasks, she found herself thinking of the sheriff. She wondered if he saw her at all, beyond her limp and her struggles. And though she told herself not to hope, her heart betrayed her each time his shadow crossed near. But conflict within the village grew sharper. The proud young warrior challenged the sheriff one night, accusing him of bringing danger by standing against the riders. He claimed the sheriff's badge had marked them as a target. Voices rose, the circle of fire burning with anger. The girl watched, her heart pounding as she feared the two men might come to blows. Yet the sheriff did not raise his voice or his fists. He only looked at the warrior with steady eyes and said, "The danger was already here. You just didn't want to see it." The words cut deeper than any blade. And though the warrior stormed away, the truth in them could not be denied. Still, doubt spread. Some questioned whether standing against the riders was worth the blood that might follow. Families whispered of leaving, of abandoning the valley altogether. Others vowed to fight, even if it meant death. The girl heard these whispers and felt her own fear grow. She had never been strong enough to fight. What place did she have in a battle that loomed like a storm on the horizon? Yet fate has a way of pulling even the most forgotten into the heart of conflict. One evening, while gathering herbs along the stream, she heard voices not of her people, but of the riders. They had drawn closer, their laughter cruel, their plans spoken openly, thinking no one else was near. She crouched low in the reeds, her breath trembling as she listened. They spoke of striking soon, of burning the village to break the people's spirit, of taking what they wished. Her blood ran cold. She wanted to run, but her body betrayed her with its weakness. She stumbled on the rocks, and the riders turned. Their voices cutting through the night, she barely escaped. The sound of hooves chasing her until the sheriff's shadow appeared on the trail. With a steady arm, he pulled her to safety, his revolver flashing once in warning. The riders retreated, unwilling to risk more that night. But the message was clear. The storm was closer than ever. The girl trembled in his arms. Not from fear alone, but from the weight of being seen. Truly seen by the man who had pulled her from danger? She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. The sheriff said nothing either, only nodded once before walking her back to the village. Yet something passed between them, unspoken but powerful. It's like the first spark of fire on dry kindling. That night the elders gathered once more, the air heavy with decision. The riders would strike soon. The village could not run forever. The people would have to stand. And as the drums echoed into the desert, the girl sat alone, her heart torn between fear and a strange new hope. But the riders were not the only threat. Jealous eyes watched her from the shadows, angry that the sheriff had shown her any care at all. Old grudges stirred, and whispers began that she, the unwanted girl, had somehow brought the outsider too close. Suspicion grew, not only against the sheriff, but against her. The desert waited, silent but restless, knowing the moment of reckoning was drawing near. And in that silence, every soul Apache rider and sheriff alike prepared for the fire that was about to break loose. The valley grew colder as the nights deepened. Though the chill came not from the wind but from the knowledge that the riders were near. Fires burned longer, and the people spoke in low voices, as if raising them to high might call danger down upon them. The girl felt the heaviness too. Everywhere she turned, she saw Eni's mothers clutching their children closer. Young men sharpening weapons again and again, elders staring into the flames as though seeking answers in the embers. The sheriff rode the outskirts each day, his horse carrying him along the ridges and narrow trails, always watching. His silence had grown sharper, his eyes restless, his jaw set tighter than before. Though he spoke little, his presence alone reminded the villagers that danger was not a matter of if, but when. And though many still distrusted him, none could deny that his steadiness gave them something to hold on to. Yet not everyone welcomed him. The proud young warrior's anger simmered like dry wood ready to catch flame. Each time the sheriff returned to the village, the warrior's eyes followed, filled with resentment. His pride was wounded by the way others began to listen to the lawmen, and worse, by the way the girl sometimes looked at him. In a place where she had always been unseen, even the smallest glance carried weight. The warrior told himself it was not jealousy. But deep inside he felt the sting of being overlooked. The girl tried to keep to her tasks, but whispers followed her now. Some villagers accused her of drawing the sheriff closer, of distracting him from what truly mattered. Others said the riders would come harder because of his bond with her. The words cut like thorns, and though she had lived with rejection all her life, this new suspicion carried a sharper edge. For the first time she feared her presence itself was a danger. But the sheriff did not turn away. When he saw her near the stream or carrying wood, he gave her the same steady nod he gave anyone else. Yet in his silence, she felt something unspoken, as if he understood the loneliness that pressed down on her. She wanted to ask him why he stayed, what tied him to a people who were not his own, but her voice failed her each time. And so the questions lingered. It's unspoken like the desert wind before a storm. Then came the night when the first flames appeared on the horizon. A small blaze set to test their nerves lit up the distant hills. The riders were sending a message. They were close, and they were ready. Scouts returned breathless, reporting that more men had joined the scarred leader. They were gathering like wolves, circling a campfire, waiting for the moment to strike. The village braced itself. The sheriff stood before the people, his voice calm, his words sharp. He told them where to place guards, where to hold their line, how to use the land itself as defense. The elders nodded, some reluctantly, but all knew there was no turning back now. The girl watched him as he spoke, her heart twisting with fear. She wanted to believe his calm meant safety, but she could see in his eyes that he knew the odds were heavy against them. The proud young warrior could no longer hold his tongue. He stood before the circle, his voice loud, declaring that they should not rely on a man who had no blood ties to their people. He claimed the sheriff would abandon them when the riders struck hardest. Some murmured in agreement, others shook their heads, but the division cut deep. The sheriff did not argue. He only looked at the warrior with that same quiet gaze, then turned away. Yet his silence carried more weight than any shouted defense. The girl lay awake that night, unable to sleep. The stars stretched endlessly above her, cold and bright, while her heart churned with dread. She thought of the riders' laughter she had overheard, the promise of fire and blood. She thought of the sheriff's eyes, steady but shadowed. And she thought of her own place in it, Ola girl unwanted, whispered about, yet standing in the path of something greater than herself. By morning, the tension was unbearable. The riders had been spotted again, closer now, their horses kicking up dust on the ridges. The people gathered what they could, children clung to their mothers, and the men tightened their grips on weapons. Every heartbeat felt like the drum before a dance of war. The sheriff mounted his horse, riding to the edge of the village, his figure tall against the horizon. He was not one to give speeches, but his presence alone felt like a shield. The girl stood at the stream, staring at her reflection. She wondered if she had any role in what was to come, or if she would remain as she always had watching from the shadows while others decided the fate of her people. But deep inside, something stirred. Perhaps the Creator had given her not strength of body, but strength of spirit. Perhaps her time was not to fight with weapons, but with courage no one expected from her. The riders gathered at last. Dust rose in thick clouds as their horses thundered down the trail. The scarred leader rode at the front, his eyes burning with greed and hatred. Behind him, men shouted and brandished weapons, their voices carrying across the valley like the growl of thunder. The villagers tightened their line. The sheriff dismounted and stood in the center, and the girl's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment everything had led to, the clash of pride, fear, and survival. The sheriff's hand hovered near his revolver. The young warrior clenched his spear with trembling rage, and the girl gripped the edge of her shawl, her heart racing as if it would leap from her chest. The riders slowed at the edge of the village, their leader sneering, his voice carrying promises of destruction. The sheriff answered not with anger, but with calm defiance. The people behind him waited, the air thick with silence, so sharp it seemed the whole desert held its breath, and then hooves struck harder. Voices rose louder, and the first movement came like the crack of lightning before a storm. The clash had begun to gather. Nothing could hold it back now. Would the sheriff's silence still carry strength when the guns were drawn? Would the villagers stand together or break under fear? And would the girl, the one no one had ever wanted, find her place in the fire that was about to fall upon them all? The desert waited, ancient and unchanging, ready to witness what came next. The moment of reckoning was no longer approaching, it was here. The first shot shattered the silence, echoing across the valley like thunder rolling off stone cliffs. Horses reared, warriors shouted, and the riders surged forward in a wave of dust and fury. The sheriff's revolver spoke quick and sharp, each strike deliberate, each movement steady. Behind him, the Apache men held their ground, spears flashing and arrows slicing through the air. The clash came like a storm breaking open, fierce and merciless. The scarred leader drove his horse hard toward the village, his eyes locked on the sheriff. He wanted to crush the man who had stood in his way, to break him in front of everyone. The sheriff met him head-on, calm, even as chaos exploded around them. Their eyes met across the smoke and dust, and in that moment both knew the outcome would shape not just the night, but the lives of all who watched. The girl stood near the fires, her body trembling, her heart pounding with fear. For so long she had believed her weakness made her useless in moments like this. But as the battle raged, she saw mothers struggling to gather children, elders unable to move quickly enough. Without thinking, she rushed forward, guiding them toward safer ground, carrying what her small frame could manage. She did not hold a weapon, yet in that moment, courage rose in her chest, stronger than any blade. The proud young warrior fought with all his strength, his pride pushing him into the thickest part of the battle. At first, he sought to prove himself above the sheriff, but as the riders pressed harder, his anger turned to something else. He saw the sheriff standing firm, protecting the people with no hesitation. And slowly the bitterness that had burned inside him gave way to understanding. For the first time, he fought not against the sheriff, but beside him, the riders tried to burn the village, tossing fire toward the roofs and fences. But the people beat back the flames with wet hides and buckets from the stream. Smoke rose thick into the night sky, stinging eyes and choking lungs, but no one faltered. The valley itself seemed to roar with resistance, every rock and tree echoing the will of those who refused to be broken. The scarred leader charged at last, drawing his blade as his horse thundered forward. The sheriff stepped out from the circle of firelight, revolver low but ready, his boots firm in the dust. The world seemed to hold still in that breathless moment. Then steel clashed against lead, a struggle fierce and close, more than just strength against strength. It was a fight of will, of justice against greed, of one man standing for what so many feared to lose. The girl watched, unable to breathe, as the sheriff faced the leader. Each strike, each move, seemed to stretch time itself. The clash was not quick, but long, filled with dust and shouts, until at last the scarred man fell hard to the earth. His horse bolted into the darkness, and silence fell heavy across the battlefield. The sheriff stood, chest heaving, revolver smoking. His eyes steady, even as sweat and dust streaked his face. The riders who had followed their leader looked around, their courage broken. One by one, they turned their horses and fled into the night, leaving behind only the echo of their defeat. Slowly, the noise of battle faded, replaced by the ragged breathing of those who had survived. The fire crackled, the smoke thinned, and the village stood battered but unbroken. The people gathered, looking to the sheriff not as an outsider now, but as one who had stood between them and destruction. The proud young warrior stepped forward, his pride softened, his voice low as he acknowledged what he had once denied, that the sheriff's strength had saved them. For the first time, there was respect in his eyes. The girl stood apart, her hands trembling, her heart aching with both fear and relief. She had not fought with weapons, but she had fought in her own way, guiding the helpless, facing the smoke, standing when she wanted to hide. And in the sheriff's quiet gaze as he found her among the crowd, she saw that he knew this too. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not for what she lacked, but for what she had given. In the days that followed, the village began to heal. Roofs were mended, fields tended, and songs of survival rose once more. The people spoke not just of loss but of endurance, of standing together when the storm came. The sheriff remained, helping rebuild, his silence still his closest companion. Yet in that silence, something had changed. The villagers no longer saw him as a stranger. He was part of their story now, tied by blood not of kin but of sacrifice. The proud young warrior carried his lessons too. His pride was tempered by humility, his anger cooled by the memory of fighting alongside the sheriff. In time, he grew into a leader who valued unity over glory, and though he still carried fire in his heart, it no longer burned against his own people. For the girl, life did not suddenly transform into ease. She still moved with her limp, still carried the weight of being different. But something within her had shifted. She had discovered courage not in strength of body, but in strength of spirit. The whispers that once haunted her faded as others began to see her not as a burden, but as someone who had stood firm in the face of fear. And in the sheriff's quiet presence, she found a kind of kinship. Two souls, marked by pain, yet bound by resilience. One evening, as the desert sun painted the sky with fire, the sheriff stood by the stream where the girl often went to think. The water shimmered in the fading light, and the air carried a rare peace. He spoke little, as always, but his eyes told her more than words ever could. She understood then that his path might not stay forever in the valley, but his presence had left a mark that would never fade. The village thrived in the seasons that followed, their story carried in songs and spoken around fires. They remembered the night the riders came, the night fear tried to break them, and how they stood together. The sheriff became a part of that story, a symbol of quiet strength, of justice standing firm when all seemed lost, and the girl, once unwanted, became part of it too. Her courage was remembered, her spirit honored, her name spoken with respect. She had found her place not by trying to be what she could not, but by embracing what she already was. In the end, that was her victory. As the desert stretched endlessly, its winds carrying whispers of old and new stories alike, one truth remained clear. Survival was not only about strength of arm, but strength of heart. The sheriff had shown it, the warrior had learned it, and the girl had lived it. When travelers passed through the valley years later, they would hear the tale of the night fire threatened to consume an Apache village, and how a quiet sheriff and a girl no one thought important had helped turn the tide. It was a story of courage, of unity, of finding worth in unlikely places. The desert kept its silence, but for those who listened closely, it carried echoes of that night, the clash of hooves, the crack of gunfire, the cry of courage rising against fear. And in those echoes lived the memory of people who stood their ground, and of a girl who discovered her strength when the world needed it most. The story ended not in fire, but in endurance, a reminder that even the quietest voices, even the most overlooked hearts, can change the course of fate. And as the stars stretched once more across the vast sky, the valley held its peace, carrying forward the lessons carved into its earth.